The American Yawp, Chapter 3, Colliding Cultures. Section 1, Introduction. While the Spanish solidified control over Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean, other European powers challenged Spanish colonial ventures in the Americas. During the 16th century, the Portuguese began to establish permanent settlements on the coasts of Brazil. The French made headways in Canada and the Caribbean. The Dutch established colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and Brazil. The English captured Jamaica from the Spanish and established settlements in the Caribbean and extensively on the Atlantic seaboard of North America. By the end of the 17th century, Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, Sweden, and Denmark all established permanent settlements in the Americas. Colonial competition over the exploitation of the resources of the Americas had begun. All the while, the vast majority of people inhabiting the Americas were indigenous peoples. Native Americans lived in thousands of different polities and nations, spanning both continents from pole to pole. Outside of Spanish conquests in Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean, Native peoples overwhelmingly controlled most of the Americas, and their power was unrivaled in the interior. But in the 16th century, Native American and indigenous peoples underwent immense changes in response to climate change, the introduction of European and African diseases, mass migrations, and trade with Europeans. In many ways, by the end of the 17th century, the Americas had become a new world for peoples of African, Asian, European, and Native American descent. Section 2, New Worlds, Native and Atlantic. The 17th century was a time of drastic change for Native American and indigenous peoples. In North America, changes began with the abandonment of large settlements like Cahokia and Chaco Canyon in the 13th and 14th centuries at the beginning of the Little Ice Age, 14th-19th centuries. Agricultural productivity declined in North America as the Earth's axis tilted slightly. This cooled the northern hemisphere a few degrees annually, shortening the average growing seasons, and thus leading to political instability in the paramount chiefdoms of the Mississippian civilization. Mass migrations across the continent intensified as Native people sought better opportunities. Some Native polities moved away from large, centralized chiefdoms toward more egalitarian, decentralized communities, but numerous Native paramount chiefdoms persisted into the 17th century: the Appalachian in Florida, Coffeetchequi in the Carolinas, Coosa and Tuscaloosa in Alabama and Georgia, the Powhatan in Virginia, the Caddo in Texas and Louisiana, and the Casqui, Anlico, and Quigualtam along the Mississippi River. A chiefdom consisted of a centralized political and religious center, with outlying towns of about 1,000 to 5,000 people. Paramount chiefdoms were made up of a few or dozens of those centralized chiefdoms led by a single ruler or ruling family. In the Southwest, Native communities were organized into farming communities that the Spanish called pueblos that could have thousands of inhabitants, such as in the Zuni, Hopi, Tegex, Pecos, Jemez, Taos, and Acoma communities. The introduction of Eastern Hemisphere diseases also had devastating effects on Native American and indigenous populations, who lacked prior exposure and immunity. Estimates of death due to foreign pathogens, subsequent infections, and famine range between 30% and 90% of the populations of the Americas. Certain Native populations, who had sustained contact with Europeans and Africans, experienced catastrophic depopulation. For example, in the Caribbean, European colonialism and the enslavement of Native peoples exacerbated the spread of disease. Working enslaved people to exhaustion made them more susceptible to infections, and the capture of new slaves for the replacement of deceased enslaved people further spread disease in a vicious cycle that had severe consequences. However, away from sustained contact with Europeans and Africans, epidemics had dire local effects, but did not spread across the continent in one catastrophic wave of disease. Various microbes and pathogens spread locally through native and colonial networks as a series of epidemics that repeated every 7 to 10 years for over 2 centuries. Instead of a single mass epidemic, Native peoples from 1550 to 1750 experienced waves of new pathogens, leading over time to catastrophic population losses and fundamental social changes. Scholars have recently begun to call these social changes among Native American and indigenous peoples the 17th century transformation, or a Native New World. Native peoples responded to climate change and epidemic diseases with social, religious, and political change. Native communities were also transformed by the introduction of European goods, particularly metalwares, firearms, and linens. New flora and fauna were also introduced, like horses, pigs, and peaches. Trade between native groups and with Europeans for access to those goods became increasingly important over the 17th century. Native people traded food, animal furs and skins, luxury items, clothing, and native captives with Europeans. Competition among Native peoples over resources for trade intensified conflict and led to diplomatic alliances during this period, leading to the formation of many of the present-day Native nations. Native peoples were not static. The Americas were undergoing transformational changes that predated the arrival of Europeans and Africans. Yet many of those changes would only intensify over the next century as native peoples adapted to an increasingly changing world. The world changed for Europeans and Africans as well. Through cultural, economic, and social collisions, including exchanges of materials, biology, DNA, and ideas, Europeans, Africans, and indigenous Americans changed through contact with one another and with new social and physical environments. New communities were created, destroyed, and recreated in processes of transformation and exchange that altered the history of Africa, Europe, North America, and South America. The Atlantic that connects these four continents serves as the stage where human beings prompted these changes. For this reason, historians have begun to refer to the period of first contact between these peoples, 14th-15th centuries, until the 19th century, as the Atlantic world. The movement of goods and biology, plants, animals, people, and pathogens, across the Atlantic, has often been described as the Columbian Exchange. This interchange across the Atlantic had profound effects on people and environments across the globe as new industrial goods, food items, animals, textiles, plants, and diseases spread, or, when extinct or out of use, alongside human migrations. Point 6. But Atlantic history moves beyond just the exchange of goods to understand how communities reacted and adapted to those changes. Indigenous Americans, Africans, and Europeans all went through processes of creation and destruction in the Atlantic. They created new societies, transformed their politics and religions, and adapted to new problems and opportunities that arose. Atlantic history is more than the exchange of goods and living beings. It is as much about the exchange of ideas, the meaning of slavery and freedom, owning and occupying land and territory, which religion offered salvation, the roles of women in society, and many more. For example, free and enslaved Africans were forced to create new societies in the Americas and Europe, while communities in Africa changed drastically through trade and interaction with Europeans. As discussed earlier, Native Americans adapted to a changing new world due to the introduction of new goods, slavery, disease, migration, and climate change. Europeans adapted their societies, economies, politics, and religions to new environments and through interactions with each other, Native peoples, and Africans. The connection of people from four continents transformed the Atlantic world in both creative and destructive ways. This chapter highlights some of those transformations between the 1560s and 1660s. Section 3. Challenging Spain. In the first half of the 16th century, Spanish colonists fought frequently with Florida's native peoples as well as with other Europeans. The Spanish launched expeditions into the interior of southeastern North America in attempts to find large metropolitan native communities with precious metals similar to the Aztecs in Mexico and the Inca in Peru. Native peoples opposed, avoided, misled, and cooperated with these expeditions to get Spanish soldiers to move beyond their own communities. In 1526, Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón established a colony near Sapelo Sound on the coast of Georgia that collapsed within months of Ayllón's death due to illness. In 1539, Hernando de Soto, a veteran of Pizarro's expedition to Peru, landed an army near Tampa Bay and began to move up the Florida coast. De Soto and his men traversed the southeast for 4 years until De Soto's death in 1542. The Spanish survivors abandoned the expedition, built boats, and sailed down the Mississippi River to Mexico. De Soto's invasion depended upon ransacking native communities and taking native captives in a futile search for material wealth. The expedition came into direct conflict with dozens of native polities and led directly to the destruction of the Tuscaloosa paramount chiefdom in central Alabama after the Battle of Mobila in 1540. De Soto's invasion disrupted native communities in the region, who found their leaders could not protect their people or crops from Spanish invasions. This often led to a reordering of native political and social organizations. Native communities adapted in the face of the Spanish invasion while limiting the advance of Spanish colonialism in North America. But Spain made inroads in Florida. In the 1560s, Spain expelled French Protestants, called Huguenots, from the area near modern-day Jacksonville in northeast Florida. In 1586, English privateer Sir Francis Drake burned the wooden settlement of St. Augustine, but Spain quickly rebuilt it. At the dawn of the 17th century, Spain's reach in Florida extended from the mouth of the St. Johns River south to the environs of St. Augustine, an area of roughly 1,000 square miles. The Spaniards attempted to duplicate methods for establishing control used previously in Mexico, the Caribbean, and the Andes. The Crown granted missionaries the right to live among Timucua and Guale villagers in the late 1500s and early 1600s, and encouraged settlement through the encomienda system, grants of native labor. In the 1630s, the mission system extended into the Apalachee District in the Florida Panhandle. The Appalachee, one of the most powerful nations in Florida at the time of contact, claimed the territory from the modern Florida-Georgia border to the Gulf of Mexico. Appalachee farmers grew an abundance of corn and other crops. Native American traders carried surplus products east along the Camino Real, the Royal Road, that connected the western anchor of the mission system with St. Augustine. Spanish settlers drove cattle eastward across the St. Johns River and established ranches as far west as Appalachia. Still, Spain held Florida tenuously. Native peoples challenged Spanish control in Florida, particularly over the expanding mission system. Missions were violent, exploitative endeavors that depended upon native headmen and headwomen providing laborers and resources on behalf of missionaries and Spanish troops in return for Spanish gifts and support for native leaders. The Timucuan peoples in Central Florida began to reject the missionaries in their communities for their abusive labor demands and prohibitions of native religious and social practices. Timucuans also blamed friars for the devastating effects of disease on their communities. In 1656, Timucuans rallied together an alliance of towns and began attacking the few Spaniards and enslaved Africans in their communities. Timucuans appealed to the Appalachee for support, who rejected their overtures in favor of the Spanish. The Appalachee attacked Timucuan towns and helped the Spanish apprehend the leaders of the rebellion. The Spanish executed 11 Timucuan leaders, displaying their bodies across Timucua as a warning against further rebellion. The Timucuan rebellion made clear that Spanish power and the mission system in Florida depended upon alliances with native peoples. While Spain plundered the New World, unrest plagued Europe. The Reformation threw England and France, the two European powers capable of contesting Spain, into turmoil. Long and expensive conflicts drained time, resources, and lives. Millions died from religious violence in France alone. As the violence diminished in Europe, however, religious and political rivalries continued in the New World. The Spanish exploitation of New Spain's riches inspired European monarchs to invest in exploration and conquest. Reports of Spanish atrocities spread throughout Europe and provided a humanitarian justification for European colonization. An English reprint of the writings of Bartolomé de las Casas bore the sensational title, Popery Truly Displayed in Its Bloody Colors, or a faithful narrative of the horrid and unexampled massacres, butcheries, and all manners of cruelties that hell and malice could invent, committed by the Popish Spanish. An English writer explained that Native Americans were simple and plain men and lived without great labor. But in their lust for gold, the Spaniards forced the people that were not used to labor to stand all the day in the hot sun gathering gold in the sand of the rivers. By this means a great number of them, not used to such pains, died, and a great number of them, seeing themselves brought from so quiet a life to such misery and slavery, of desperation killed themselves. And many would not marry, because they would not have their children slaves to the Spaniards. The Spanish accused their critics of fostering a black legend. The black legend drew on religious differences and political rivalries. Spain had successful conquests in France, Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands, and left many in those nations yearning to break free from Spanish influence. English writers argued that Spanish barbarities were foiling a tremendous opportunity for the expansion of Christianity across the globe, and that a benevolent conquest of the New World by non-Spanish monarchies offered the surest salvation of the New World's pagan masses. With these religious justifications, and with obvious economic motives, Spain's rivals arrived in the New World. The French crown subsidized exploration in the early 16th century. Early French explorers sought a fabled Northwest Passage, a mythical waterway passing through the North American continent to Asia. Despite the wealth of the New World, Asia's riches still beckoned to Europeans. Canada's St. Lawrence River appeared to be such a passage, stretching deep into the continent and into the Great Lakes. French colonial possessions centered on these bodies of water, and, later, down the Mississippi River to the port of New Orleans. French expeditions to North America began in 1534, when Jacques Cartier explored Newfoundland and the Gulf of St. Lawrence in present-day Canada. In 1535, Cartier returned and sailed up the St. Lawrence River, where he encountered Iroquoian peoples of the towns of Stadacona and Hochelaga, capturing the headman of Stadacona, Donnacona, and returning to France with him, where Donnacona later died. Cartier returned in 1541 to Stadacona and established a colony near there at Cap Rouge, Quebec, that was abandoned due to disease and starvation in 1543. The French did not attempt to establish a colony again in Canada for over 50 years. In 1603, the French returned to Canada to establish Port Royal in Acadia, Nova Scotia, and launched trading expeditions that stretched down the Atlantic coast as far as Cape Cod. French colonization developed through investment from private trading companies. The needs of the fur trade set the future pattern of French colonization. Founded in 1608 under the leadership of Samuel de Champlain, Quebec provided the foothold for what would become New France. Established among Montagnais and Algonquian communities, French fur traders placed a higher value on cooperating with indigenous people than on establishing a successful French colonial footprint. Asserting dominance in the region could have been to their own detriment, as it might have compromised their access to skilled Native American trappers who provided the furs and therefore wealth. Few Frenchmen traveled to the New World to settle permanently. By the 1660s, around 3,200 French colonists lived in small communities on the St. Lawrence River in Quebec, 1608, Trois-Rivières, 1634, and Montreal, 1642. Many persecuted French Protestants, Huguenots, sought to emigrate after France criminalized Protestantism in 1685, but all non-Catholics were forbidden in New France. The French preference for trade over permanent settlement fostered more cooperative and mutually beneficial relationships with Native Americans than was typical among the Spanish and English. Perhaps eager to debunk the anti-Catholic elements of the Black Legend, the French worked to cultivate cooperation with Native Americans. Jesuit missionaries, for instance, adopted different conversion strategies than the Spanish Franciscans. Spanish missionaries brought natives into enclosed missions, whereas Jesuits more often lived with or alongside indigenous people. Many French fur traders married Native American women. The offspring of Native American women and French men were so common in New France that the French developed a word for these children, métis, meaning mixed, similar to Spanish mestizos. The Wendat people developed a particularly close relationship with the French, and many converted to Christianity and engaged in the fur trade. But close relationships with the French would come at a high cost. The Wendat were decimated by the ravages of European disease, and entanglements in French and Dutch conflicts proved disastrous. Despite this, some native peoples maintained alliances with the French. The French sent missionaries into native communities and established missions, like Kanawake, on the St. Lawrence River south of Montreal. Missions attracted native converts like Kateri, Catherine Tekakwitha, a woman born in Gandawague in the 1650s, to a Mohawk man and an Algonquian captive. Kateri was afflicted at a young age with smallpox and lost most of her family to the disease. She converted to Catholicism, moved to Kanawake, and took vows of chastity. Through abstention, fasting, and flagellation, Kateri suffered for her new faith and died slowly of disease at the age of 24. She was canonized as a Catholic saint in 2012. Her story demonstrates the changing world for native peoples in the 17th century, alongside the suffering and religious fervor that epidemic disease could bring about. Pressure from the powerful Haudenosaunee in the east pushed many Algonquian-speaking peoples, like Kateri's mother, toward French territory in the mid-17th century, and together they crafted what historians have called a middle ground, a kind of cross-cultural space that allowed for native and European interaction, negotiation, and accommodation. This was particularly true for the region upriver from Montreal to the western Great Lakes that became known as the Pays d'en Haut, the Upper Country, in New France. In the Upper Country, French traders created trade and kinship connections with Algo. Pressure from the powerful Haudenosaunee in the east pushed many Algonquian-speaking peoples, like Kateri's mother, toward French territory in the mid-17th century, and together they crafted what historians have called a middle ground, a kind of cross-cultural space that allowed for native and European interaction, negotiation, and accommodation. This was particularly true for the region upriver from Montreal to the western Great Lakes that became known as the Pays d'en Haut, the Upper Country in New France. In the Upper Country, French traders created trade and kinship connections with Algonquian speakers, Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Illini, Miami, Mascoutin, and others. Iroquoian speakers, Wendat and Petuns, and Siouan speakers, Winnebago. French traders adopted, sometimes clumsily, the gift-giving and mediation strategies expected of native leaders. Natives similarly engaged in the impersonal European market and adapted, often haphazardly, to European laws. Familial and trading alliances with native communities provided the backbone of French authority in New France. The Great Lakes Middle Ground experienced tumultuous success throughout the late 17th and early 18th centuries until English colonial officials and American settlers swarmed the region. The pressures of European expansion strained even the closest bonds. The Dutch, the Netherlands, a small maritime nation with great wealth, achieved considerable colonial success. In 1581, the Netherlands had officially broken away from the Habsburgs and won a reputation as the freest of the new European nations. Dutch women maintained separate legal identities from their husbands and could therefore hold property and inherit full estates. Ravaged by the turmoil of the Reformation, the Dutch embraced greater religious tolerance and freedom of the press than other European nations. 0.17 radical Protestants, Catholics, and Jews flocked to the Netherlands. The English pilgrims, for instance, fled first to the Netherlands before sailing to the New World years later. The Netherlands built its colonial empire through the work of experienced merchants and skilled sailors. The Dutch were the most advanced capitalists in the modern world and marshaled extensive financial resources by creating innovative financial organizations such as the Amsterdam Stock Exchange and the Dutch East India Company. Although the Dutch offered liberties, they offered very little democracy. Power remained in the hands of only a few. And Dutch liberties certainly had their limits. The Dutch advanced the slave trade and brought enslaved Africans with them to the New World. Slavery was an essential part of Dutch capitalist triumphs. Sharing the European hunger for access to Asia, in 1609, the Dutch commissioned Englishman Henry Hudson to discover the fabled Northwest Passage through North America. He failed, of course, but found the Hudson River, claiming modern-day New York for the Dutch, where later Dutch merchants returned to trade European goods for furs with local Munsee, Mohican, Lenape, and other Algonquian groups. There, they established New Netherland in 1614, an essential part of the Dutch New World Empire. The Netherlands chartered the Dutch West India Company in 1621 and established colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and North America. The island of Manhattan provided a launching pad to support its spiteful of the Spanish and mindful of the Black legend. The Dutch were determined not to repeat Spanish atrocities. They fashioned guidelines for New Netherland that conformed to the ideas of Hugo Grotius, a legal philosopher who believed that native peoples possessed the same natural rights as Europeans. Colony leaders insisted that land be purchased. In 1626, Peter Minuit therefore bought Manhattan from the Munsee people. Despite the seemingly honorable intentions, it is likely the Dutch paid the wrong people for the land, either intentionally or unintentionally, or that the Munsee and the Dutch understood the transaction in very different terms. Transactions like these illustrated both the Dutch attempt to find a more peaceful process of colonization and the inconsistency between European and Native American understandings of property. Like the French, the Dutch sought to profit, not to conquer. Trade with native peoples became New Netherland's central economic activity. Dutch traders carried wampum along native trade routes and exchanged it for beaver pelts. Wampum, Ot Goa in Iroquoian, consisted of shell beads from the southern New England and Chesapeake coasts, fashioned by Algonquian and Iroquoian women to create a valued ceremonial and diplomatic commodity. Native women labored to string the white and purple beads together into bands or belts for specific diplomatic or ceremonial purposes, speaking the words of the agreement into the beads, imbuing wampum with communal and spiritual power. In colonial exchanges, wampum became a currency that could buy anything from a loaf of bread to a plot of land. In addition to developing these trading networks, the Dutch also established farms, settlements, and lumber camps. The West India Company directors implemented the patroon system to encourage colonization. The patroon system granted large estates to wealthy landlords, who subsequently paid passage for tenant farmers to work their land. Expanding Dutch settlements correlated with deteriorating relations with local Native Americans. In the interior of the continent, the Dutch retained valuable alliances with the Iroquois to maintain Beverwyck, modern-day Albany, as a hub for the fur trade. In the places where the Dutch built permanent settlements, the ideals of peaceful colonization succumbed to the settlers' increasing demand for land. Armed conflicts erupted as colonial settlements encroached on native villages and hunting lands, while trade exacerbated conflict between native peoples over access to Dutch goods. Profit and peace, it seemed, could not coexist. Labor shortages, meanwhile, crippled Dutch colonization. The patroon system failed to bring enough tenants, and the colony could not attract a sufficient number of indentured servants to satisfy the colony's backers. In response, the colony imported 11 enslaved people owned by the company in 1626, the same year that Minuit purchased Manhattan. Enslaved laborers were tasked with building New Amsterdam, modern-day New York City, including a defensive wall along the northern edge of the colony, the site of modern-day Wall Street. They created its roads and maintained its all-important port. Fears of racial mixing led the Dutch to import enslaved women, enabling the formation of African-Dutch families. The colony's first African marriage occurred in 1641, and by 1650 there were at least 500 enslaved Africans in the colony. By 1660, New Amsterdam had the largest urban enslaved population on the continent. As was typical of the practice of African slavery in much of the early 17th century, Dutch slavery in New Amsterdam was less comprehensively exploitative than later systems of American slavery. Some enslaved Africans, for instance, successfully sued for back wages. When several enslaved people owned by the company fought for the colony against the Munsee, they petitioned for their freedom and won a kind of half-freedom that allowed them to work their own land in return for paying a large tithe or tax to their enslavers. The children of these half-free laborers remained held in bondage by the West India Company, however. The Dutch, who so proudly touted their liberties, grappled with the reality of African slavery, and some New Netherlanders protested the enslavement of Christianized Africans. The economic goals of the colony slowly crowded out these cultural and religious objections, and the much boasted of liberties of the Dutch came to exist alongside increasingly brutal systems of slavery. The Haudenosaunee. Beginning in the 16th century, 5 Iroquoian nations that occupied territory south and east of Lake Ontario formed the Great League of Peace, better known as the Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse, or the Five Nations Iroquois. The Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk formed a new religious and political coalition centered on the spiritual message of Diganawida, who used words of condolence to remove grief from the Iroquoian leader Hiawatha. These words of condolence and diplomatic alliances between Iroquoian sachems, headmen, were created to establish non-violent means of conflict resolution within the Great League to end the cycle of mourning wars between the 5 nations. Mourning wars were raids to take enemies captive, intended to ease the suffering of the matrilineal, female descent households who had lost loved ones. By ending the cycle of violent reprisals between League members, the Haudenosaunee were able to establish themselves as the dominant power in the eastern Great Lakes until the American Revolution. But peace within the League did not mean peace outside of the League. Over the first decades of the 16th century, the Haudenosaunee found themselves cut off from access to new European settlements and the trade they provided from the French on the St. Lawrence River, the English in New England and the Chesapeake, and the Dutch in the Hudson River Valley. The Haudenosaunee sought access to whelk and quahog clamshells from the Atlantic coasts that, when sewn together, made wampum, and furs for trade with Europeans from the fertile forests of the Ohio River Valley and Canada. With the establishment of Fort Orange, present-day Albany, by the Dutch in 1614 in the heart of the Hudson Valley, the Mohawks sought to monopolize trade with the Dutch by cutting off Mohican and other Algonquian traders to the north and west from access to the fort. The Haudenosaunee began raiding Algonquian and other Iroquoian-speaking peoples' trade caravans to use stolen furs as trade goods with the Dutch. These raids set off a series of conflicts with neighboring peoples over the next decades, including against Mohicans, 1624, St. Lawrence Iroquois, 1630s, Winrows, 1638, Wendat, 1640s, Petons, 1650, Algonquians, 1650, Neutrals, 1651, Eries, 1657, and Susquehannocks, 1663. As the scale and pace of conflicts intensified, the Haudenosaunee looked to replace lost loved ones by incorporating captives taken from their enemies and adopting them into their matrilineal households. This drive to replace population losses fueled further conflict. Due to their expanding trade, raids, and adoption of outsiders, the Haudenosaunee became exposed to epidemic diseases brought by Europeans and Africans. The first recorded instances of smallpox among the 5 nations date to 1633 and again in 1640 to 1641. The subsequent population losses due to disease fueled further mourning wars to take captives to replace lost loved ones. Through this strategy of maintaining peace within the Iroquoian League and subjecting outside nations to violence, the Haudenosaunee scattered dozens of native nations across the Great Lakes, the Ohio River Valley, the St. Lawrence River Valley, western New England, and the northern Chesapeake. In 1675, the Haudenosaunee allied themselves with the English and attacked the alliance of Algonquian native peoples led by Metacom, ensuring the survival of the New England colonies and the defeat of Metacom in King Philip's War. The alliance formed between the English and Haudenosaunee in 1676 became known as the Covenant Chain, a series of alliances between the two nations that lasted until the 7 Years' War. By 1675, the Haudenosaunee established themselves as the major power on the Great Lakes. The Portuguese had been leaders in Atlantic navigation, well ahead of Columbus's voyage. But the incredible wealth flowing from New Spain piqued the rivalry between the two Iberian countries and accelerated Portuguese colonization efforts. This rivalry created a crisis within the Catholic world, as Spain and Portugal squared off in a battle for colonial supremacy. The Pope had earlier intervened and divided the New World with the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Land east of the Tordesillas Meridian, an imaginary line dividing the North Atlantic and South America, would be given to Portugal, whereas land west of the line was reserved for Spanish conquest. In return for the license to conquer, both Portugal and Spain were instructed to treat the natives with Christian compassion and to bring them under the protection of the Church. Lucrative colonies in Africa and India initially preoccupied Portugal, but by 1530, the Portuguese turned their attention to the land that would become Brazil, driving out French traders and establishing permanent settlements at São Vicente, São Paulo, Salvador, and Rio de Janeiro. Two industries powered early colonial Brazil: sugar and the slave trade. In fact, Over the entire history of the Atlantic slave trade, more Africans were enslaved in Brazil than in any other colony in the Atlantic world. By the 18th century, gold and diamond mines were discovered in the interior of Sao Paulo and Bahia, leading to expansion westward and the further colonization of Brazil. Jesuit missionaries brought Christianity to Brazil, but strong elements of African and native spirituality mixed with Orthodox Catholicism to create a unique religious culture. This culture resulted from the demographics of Brazilian slavery. High mortality rates on sugar plantations required a steady influx of new enslaved laborers, thus perpetuating the cultural connection between Brazil and Africa. The reliance on new imports of enslaved laborers increased the likelihood of resistance, however, and those who escaped slavery managed to create several free settlements, called quilombos. These settlements drew from both enslaved Africans and natives, and despite frequent attacks, several endured throughout the long history of Brazilian slavery. From 1580 to 1640, the Portuguese crown was held by Philip II of Spain, leading to the period known as Iberian unification. Although under the same monarch, Spanish and Portuguese imperial possessions were ruled separately. Conflict between Portuguese and Spanish colonists, and especially with native communities, continued in the Rio de la Plata, particularly over Sao Paulo colonists enslaving native Guarani peoples in the region. In Brazil, these conflicts intensified when the Dutch invaded, looking to expand their own colonial possessions and profit from the sugar and slave trades. The Dutch attacked Salvador and were repulsed in 1624, but conquered the northeastern portion of Brazil in 1630, when the Dutch West India Company established its capital at Moristad, Recife. Brazilian colonists, including many free and formerly enslaved people of African descent like Henrique Dias, opposed Dutch occupation and Spanish overlordship. The Dutch invasion was about more than seizing the profitable sugar plantations of northeastern Brazil. They also sought to dominate the Atlantic slave trade by seizing Elmina in present-day Ghana in 1637. Once Portuguese independence from Spain was restored in 1640, the Dutch used the dissolution of the Iberian monarchy to expand in Africa by seizing Portuguese colonies in Luanda in Angola, São Tomé, and Anhao Bom in present-day Equatorial Guinea in 1641. The Portuguese ousted the Dutch from Brazil in 1654, with peace between the two nations resolved in 1661. Colonial competition over territory in the slave trade led to almost constant levels of warfare between European powers who sought to exploit the human and non-human resources of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. New Sweden. Sweden joined the effort to colonize North America in 1638 when the Swedish South Company settled Swedes, Finns, and Dutch colonists at Fort Christina in what is now Wilmington, Delaware. The colony was plagued by slow communication and divided loyalties between Dutch investors who wanted immediate return on their investments and Swedish colonists and investors who wanted to expand the Swedish imperial project. Indigenous Lenape and Susquehannock communities initially welcomed new Swedish traders into Delaware Bay as new sources of European goods from small European communities that did not threaten native towns. New Sweden was conquered by the Dutch in 1655, who subsequently were overtaken by the English, who renamed the New Netherland colony New York in 1664. As colonies changed territorial hands in the mid-17th century, Swedes, Dutch, Finns, Germans, and other Europeans who colonized the Delaware Valley maintained their communal identity at a local level by being loyal subjects to whichever imperial power ruled their communities. They serve as a prime example of the diversity and persistence of colonial identity through maintaining local sovereignty by pledging allegiance to new imperial regimes.